that we live in, we're going to talk about something kind of new with Power Automate. It's called UI flows. It also goes by the term robotic process automation. So it was introduced, I think, in pre-release late last year, and relatively recently they put it into full release state, so access for everybody, and you can start using it immediately. So we're going to talk a little bit about what is that? How is that different from Power Automate, and what new things can I do that I couldn't do before? So let me start by kind of giving you a little bit of a picture that might sound or look familiar to you, right? Do you have people in your organization, or maybe you're one of those people, who is keying and rekeying and rekeying in, or copying and pasting many, many times over? And this can be anything, right? It can be anything from when you're adding new users, if you're an administrator, into Office 365 and you need to set permissions and you're doing it for large bulk numbers of people at once, and you find that you're having to do the same thing again and again. Or more often than not, something kind of like this, right? Where maybe you've got some data that's maintained by some users in Excel, and maybe you've got some legacy application. And okay, maybe it's not a key punch application like what you see here, but the idea is an older application, maybe still running on a mainframe or mini computer. I just saw the government is looking all over for COBOL programmers these days to modernize some of its systems. So we actually have some of those floating around out there still, or some other legacy application. And maybe you've got some other modern internally developed application, and all of that information has to get managed. And so you're getting stuff exported into Excel from a couple of those things, and then you're taking all of those things and you're maybe merging it into some other Excel, maybe consolidating it by hand, and then maybe it's finally imported or rekeyed into some other system. It happens all the time, right? This is actually an image from a real life scenario where a restaurant chain had the source menu data from multiple people using one system for printed menus, another system for electronic displays, another for presentation of the menu on websites, and still another to occasionally issue stickers to update their printed, laminated menus that go out to all their various different restaurant locations. So not unheard of at all. That's a real life situation. We see it all the time. And in fact, maybe something that feels a little more familiar to you that we run into really frequently. And it's this idea of, hey, we have a Dynamics CRM, Dynamics 365 application. We do a lot of CRM work. Since this is the user group, I assume many of you probably come from a CRM background. And then the information has to find its way maybe into an ERP system. Maybe it's a legacy desktop ERP system. Maybe it's client server. Maybe it's a modern web ERP application. And yes, we know that the right way to do this would be to, quote, integrate, right? But that might be too expensive. Or maybe someone is preparing to replace their ERP in the next few years, and who wants to spend all that money on integration when you're really just going to be redoing all that integration a year or two down the road? So some changes may have happened to an existing integration also, and yet you don't want to open up the hood and make those changes to the integration process itself to reflect the database changes that were made in CRM and ERP. So this is just one example, but then what do people do in these situations? They do what they do time and time again. It's called a swivel chair integration, right? You have some people somewhere in your organization that say, well, I have to look up information in this one system, or maybe even key it into this one system, then turn my swivel chair, figuratively speaking, and open up this other application and re-enter that information from one system back into another system. And it's time consuming and it's error prone, and maybe worst of all, it's just dehumanizing. It's taking people and saying, you know what, your time is worth less than the time of a computer. We're gonna let you keep doing this again and again. And oftentimes people have quietly figured out how to do this without even raising their voice to say, hey, maybe there's a better way to do this. Maybe you can make better use of my time. So what we're going to talk about today is almost literally the idea of replacing what somebody is doing in that swivel chair with a bot, a robotic process automation, literally taking the keystrokes, taking the things that someone looks at on one screen and in their brain or via copying and pasting, scrapes off of that one screen, and then by hand rekeys in. The bot is going to do almost exactly that. It's literally going to look at screens, it's going to grab data, it's going to open up applications, and it's going to type things in at a simulated keyboard, right? You won't see your keys moving, but if you look at the screen, you actually see the screen doing exactly what the user would do. And I'll talk a little bit about why is that important and how is that different than Power Apps, but let's look at a real life example here as a next step. So look closely. This is going to go by kind of quickly. I'm going to try to kind of talk it through, but here's a real life actual UI flow or robotic process automation, excuse me, in action. So you can see we're on the Dynamics 365 user interface. I'm going to go down and I'm going to run a flow. So if I were a user, I would say, hey, wouldn't it be nice? I've got to take all this information. I got to move it into ERP. Let me run this flow. And so I set up a flow to do this. And the flow is looking at this opportunity form. Actually, I'm sorry, the first thing that happens with the flow is it says, okay, I'm a separate user, so log me in again to a new instance of your web browser. So I've logged back into a new instance of the web browser. More on all this later, just giving you an example now. And it says, okay, here's the opportunity. I need to grab some data from that. Oh, let me click on the account. Now I'm going to go to the account form. And just like a user, I'm looking at the account form. I'm going to grab some information from that. Back on the opportunity, let me go to the contact form. I'm going to grab some information off of that contact form too. And I've kind of cut all of that information and put that into the robotic brain to say, okay, I just lifted information from one application. Now I'm going to go open up my accounting application. And in this case, I'm simulating an accounting desktop application or client server application with Microsoft Excel, but it would work exactly the same way there. If you saw all those keystrokes just go in the file name there, that was literally robotic process automation. You can see it again here, typing in the information. It's not just moving it, it's literally entering it into the computer just as if a user were sitting at a keyboard. All the information you see it now plugging in here, this is all the information it went and lifted out of CRM, and now it's into our simulated accounting application, and it's typing it into that. You can see the first tab was the company tab. Now it's on the contact tab, and it's entering information it got from the contact record in CRM. And when it's done with that, it's going to enter a little bit of information that it got from the opportunity record in CRM into the order. And you can do this with multiple line items, for example, off of a quote or an order if you want to. I don't know how many of you have this, but I can tell you just about every client we support, even if they do integration, they wind up with some of these things that they are still doing swivel chair integration on because it's just too expensive to replace it. And there I am closing back on my accounting application without the record saved. So I can say, hey, user, the information has been entered. Maybe you need to add some to this. Maybe you need to quality assurance check it, whatever it is. But there it all is. So what a user would have had to do themselves over 5, 10, 15, 20 minutes with maybe dubious data quality outcomes has now been fully automated, and that was about a 2-minute video that played to do all of that for you. So it literally did what the user did. It opened systems, it captured data, it opened other systems, it keyed data into them, just like a user would do. Okay, so that's kind of the premise, and what we're going to walk through in the rest of today's session is, so how did I do that? Why did I do that way? How's that different from a regular Power Automate? Now, I know a lot of you, I'm sure I talk at a lot of these things. Sorry, I can't know who you are. So for those of you who don't know me yet, the quick introduction, my name is Jeff Abels. I have been working in this arena for many, many years. I kind of geek out on this whole idea, not really so much about technology first, but about people and process and then technology. And I've written a couple of books on that. And I speak more and more at webinars lately, but in the past also at a lot of live events, and hopefully those will be happening again really soon. On the personal side, my wife and I are empty nesters, so this thing probably doesn't impact us quite as much as it does a whole lot of you guys. You guys are my heroes for homeschooling your kids and being teachers and nurses and full-time workers and all of that kind of stuff too. Way to go, keep up the awesome work. We love to travel when we can. And we love to ride a motorcycle together when we can too. Those are kind of some of the fun things we're enjoying in the empty nest stage. There are 2 daughters recently married, and the reason why we are empty nesters now, that was about 3 years ago. About a year ago, to start filling up our empty nest, we adopted Verdi, our little rescue doggie, and there she is in her little bed because now she has become my office mate too. That's her right next to where I work most days these days. And the most exciting thing in the last month here, we became grandparents. So meet Theodore Evergreen Tramolini, a cool little guy that we're very excited to have in our family. And we've gotten to meet up with him once. Hopefully we'll get to see him again really soon here. So that's my personal side. I love hearing that stuff about you guys too. I know that's the most important part of getting to know each other is the business geeky stuff. Yeah, that's great. But who we really are, that's why we do the business geeky stuff, right? Okay, so today's goals. First of all, I've designed this with a specific couple of audiences in mind. So part of it is more the strategic perspective, and that is for people who say, look, I need to kind of envision solutions to business problems. I may not be the person to get hands-on with this, but I like to know what tools are out there and what they can do so that I can bring these up when I start thinking about what can I throw at problems to help solve them. And from the user perspective, I want to be here to help point people in the right direction to get started with UI flows. So if you've been working with UI flows for a while already and you're pretty well versed in them, I want to not set you up for disappointment and let you know that you may not get a whole lot out of today. But if you've been working with Power Automate for a while and you're curious about UI flows, or you've probed UI flows and you've been a little bit confused about them, you're in great company. And by the end of this session, you're going to know a lot of the ins and outs to know how to start getting productively to use with them right away. So those are my goals for the day today. Not a super deep learning, but at least pushing you in the right direction. So your takeaways, you're going to know kind of what is RPI and UI flow, how is it different from Power Automate. You're going to learn the baby steps of how to begin to build them. You're going to learn a little bit about, well, why should I and when should I do one versus the other. I'm going to talk about some of the gotchas that I stepped on in learning how to work with these to help save you some of the times. And by the way, I'm also going to conclude at the very end of the day today, not only by showing you how I built what I demoed for you a couple of slides ago with the animation, but also what is wrong with what I demoed to you and what is actually the right way to have done what I showed to you. So you'll learn all of those things so that you'll have a good position for moving forward. So first of all, before we get into the technical details, so what is robotic process automation? Well, it helps to understand how it's different from what you already do in Power Automate, which is typically described as business process automation or BPA. So business process automation or BPA is about accessing the API, and sorry for those of you who are non-technical on the call, I'm going to try not to be very technical in my terms here, but the API is the application programming interface. You guys all know what a GUI is, right? The graphical user interface or just a user interface. An API is the way computers talk to each other. A GUI is the way computers interact with human beings. So BPA or business process automation is about, hey, how do I get one computer program to maybe talk to another computer program to get things done, right? So that's the default Power Automate functionality, right? So you might say, hey, when a Microsoft form gets filled out, create a new record in CRM. That is all done with APIs. Behind the scenes, databases are talking to each other and exchanging information. Robotic process automation is about automating processes by directly interacting with the same interface that the user interacts with, right? So robotic process automation says, look, I need to look at this screen and get information off of it. And I need to open up this application and I need to key information in over here. Maybe I even need to do keystrokes that don't actually enter information, but that toggle forms or whatever it is. Exactly the same things that the user does. So if you as a user sit down and go, I can't make Power Automate do exactly what I need it to do, and yet my poor user or my poor self is having to do a lot of things that are very consistent. I'm following the same steps. Maybe there are small variances, but I could account for those with some simple rules. But automating this would be either impossible or really expensive right now, or I'd need somebody whose time is better spent doing other things. Enter robotic process automation, where you literally train a robot to do, a robot that's built into your computer to do what you are doing on the keyboard. So it does exactly what you do. I hope that's clear. It was a little bit vague to me as I got into it. Let me give you a couple of other things here too. First of all, know this, when it comes to the two different things, BPA is the preferred approach, right? You want to use the API to do as much as you can. It's more elegant, it's faster, it's less error prone, it doesn't get in the way of what the user is doing. Robotic process automation is for those gaps in functionality that BPA doesn't cover. If that's a little bit, what's he talking about to you? I'm going to come back and talk about this a little bit more later. But essentially, if you look at something saying, I see a process that is repetitive and I can see how it could potentially be automated, and yet I can't solve it with Power Automate or with a CRM workflow or whatever it is, well then RPA might be a good candidate for you. But don't throw RPA at something that you could solve with one of the other tools out there, right? It's kind of for that last mile of automation, but that last mile is the one that we have not been doing enough with for a really long time. Couple other differences here, by the way. So if you look at some of the, and don't worry about trying to drill into this, but if you look at some of the analyst ratings for things, you look at business process automation, Microsoft is rated as among the highest at doing a great job with business process automation. You look at robotic process automation, right now, this is something that came out in May of 2019 on the right, Microsoft isn't even on the list of robotic process automation because they've only just released their very first instance of this. Now, I say this for a couple reasons. I think that what it's doing is pretty darned impressive, but also this is early stage, right? So expect this to grow a lot. We've actually worked with some clients who are using what's at the top of the list there, UiPath, to do robotic process automation, and it undoubtedly is just a more mature product. But Microsoft will move up that, and there are some unique things because you're already using Power Automate that we'll talk about a little bit later. Now, one last thought on robotic process automation to try to get it inside of your head before we move on to some of the how-to stuff. If any of you, I'm dating myself here, if any of you remember something called SuperKey, which was out back in the 90s, it was a macro recording solution back in the DOS days. So everything was character-based, not graphical interfaces. You could actually say, turn on recording my keystrokes, enter your keystrokes, hit save, and you could play those back whenever you wanted to. So if you said, I always open, WordStar, I'm really dating myself here, and I type this text in there, then I have to save it, but I copy it, and then I paste it into Lotus 123, you could do a super key to do that for you. That's essentially what robotic process automation is. It got a little bit stymied over the last 20 years because it was harder to do with graphical interfaces in the web, but now it's becoming more popularized again. Or on the other hand, if you have ever recorded a macro in Excel, and you can do this still today, go and look for macros, record a macro. A macro is recording your keystrokes so that you can call that macro and play it back later. Both of those are just simple examples of robotic process automation. That's all that this is. It's recording actions from a user and playing them back, and literally playing them back, not running them in the background of some other program, but you can watch as they get played back. How important is RPA going to be? As a guy that used to do this kind of stuff in the distant past and who has missed it for over 20 years, I can tell you I see processes all the time that we have to walk by making more efficient because the value of trying to do all the real deep technical work to fully automate it isn't there. Whereas robotic process automation, you can more rapidly automate using simpler tools, things that that make a big difference. And according to this quote from Gartner, it's going to become a very, very important part of what they call hyper automation over the next several years here. Okay, so let's jump a little bit more into it. Now that we kind of have beaten the definition to death, how do we do UI flows? How in using the Microsoft framework, the Power Automate framework, what do we do? 3 simple steps I want you to remember. As with all things Microsoft or technology, it's a little more complex and nuanced than this. But to get you started, it's really 3 steps. You record what you're doing, your keystrokes, your mouse moves, the things you're looking at. You record those. You refine those. You hit the pause button and you actually look at it's scripting out all of those keystrokes as you're doing them. It's saying, okay, you clicked here, then you type this, then you looked at this. It's got a list of all those things. You go refine those and fine tune them a little bit to make them work perfectly and consistently, maybe even adding variables to them. So it's not just typing the same thing every time, but it's varying it based on the context of what's going on. And then you run it. You basically just rerun it whenever you need to get those jobs done. Okay, so record, refine, and run. Let's take a look at that. That's the general idea. But here's some of the specifics. So again, a little more nuanced. And I'm going to do lots of, by the way, screen captures that I'm going to share from you from now on. We're not going to go and do this hands-on because I want to give you little pointers as we go through this. So let's talk about this recording step. So in Power Automate, and I'm going to assume a few things here. I'm going to assume you essentially know a little bit about what Power Automate is, and you've played with it at least a little bit, right? Power Automate, classical is BPA stuff. If you've never touched Power Automate before, this is going to be, some of this is going to be a little new to you. But if you have, here's essentially where you go. So you're in Power Automate, number one. When you're in Power Automate, just as if you're going to go to any other kind of flow, number two, you go to the My Flows area. And you can kind of see there's 4 categories of flows: My Flows, Team Flows, and Business Process Flows. And lastly are UI flows. So you're going to click on UI flows. First time you do it, it's probably going to be empty. In this particular case, I have one in there because I was working on this demo when I did it. And then to create a new one, you're just going to click the New button. So far, so good. Pretty intuitive. The next thing you're going to be presented with as you do it is this screen. It's going to say, okay, are you recording a UI flow for a desktop application like Excel, or maybe your accounting application, or something that opens in its own desktop window? Or are you recording a flow for a web application? So something that's running inside of a web browser somewhere. So really important here, by the way. So this was kind of confusing to me. It's not a preference in terms of which one of these 2 tools do you want to use. It's where does your application run that you're trying to automate? Now, you might be thinking, well, wait a minute, you had 2 applications. One was running in the web, Dynamics. One was running on the desktop, Excel. Exactly. Those are going to be 2 different UI flows that you're going to create, and we'll link them together later, okay? So in our case, we would have said the web application first because that's where we're grabbing information from. So you decide which one of those you're going to do. And when you do that, you then, depending on which one you do, you're going to get 2 different things. So the first time, I want you to know this, so this is the first time only that you hit either one of those things, you're going to walk through a process of installing software on your computer. So if you start by clicking, I'm doing a desktop app first, it's going to say, okay, I want to download the UI Flows browser extension. I'm sorry, I got that backwards. UI Flow, no, I'm sorry, I was incorrect. You're going to download for a desktop app the UI Flow browser extension to your computer if you're going to build a desktop app. So you'll get the pop-up when you click it. You're going to click the download button. On the other hand, if you click a web app is what you're running your UI flow for, you're going to download the Selenium IDE extension to your desktop. I'm going to come back and talk about that in just a second. And both of these need to be installed if you're going to be doing both. So first time you do it with desktop, you're going to download and add one thing. First time you do it with web, you're going to download and add something else. There are 2 different things you need to add. Now, in both cases, those install as browser extensions, and you can kind of see it's added little icons to my up near the browser bar up there, and also I need to activate those. So I know they work with Chrome and the latest Edge. They might work with other browsers as well, but those are the 2 that I've played with and seen in the documentation. So again, one-time only process, a little bit confusing. So let me pause and mention here also, these are 2 completely different applications. So when you're automating stuff with a UI flow on your desktop, you're recording and you're playing back, you're using one application, right? That one looks more like Power Automate. If you're doing it via the web, totally different application. It's called Selenium IDE. Interestingly enough, Selenium IDE has been around since about 2004, and it's been used for automating and testing certain things with websites. So for me, when I first got into it, that was very confusing. I thought it was kind of an option or didn't really understand that it was two different things. So remember, if you're automating stuff that's happening on your desktop, one application, web, a different application. If you're doing both, you're going to record two different web UI flows, one for each different environment. Okay, so in our example, we started with the web, right? So I clicked the web thing, I installed it and went through all that stuff. Once it was installed, now I come back and say, okay, let me now start this UI flow. One other little gotcha note on this, by the way, when you install the add-ins for the first time, you usually have to do a computer restart and even a browser shutdown and restart to get everything working well. So if you're struggling with this a little bit, remember to restart everything once the add-ins are installed and that they've been activated on your individual browser. So I'm on the web UI flow. The first thing I do is I give it a name, whatever you want to name it, and then I tell it a base URL. So this says, this is where you are going to start running this, right? So in my case of Dynamics, what I said was, okay, I want to start in Dynamics. And in fact, what I decided to do is I started on a specific opportunity. Now, you're not going to run it on that opportunity every time. That's okay. You're kind of building a template that you'll tweak. So kind of start near where you want to start and know that you're going to tweak a few things as you get going. So I gave it the name of an opportunity or the link to an opportunity, and then you click the Launch Recorder button. All right, let me dismiss that. So Launch Recorder, remember our first step is record. So when I launch the recorder, it's going to pop something up. This is kind of a scary big pop-up screen. This is the Selenium IDE. It's a totally different piece of software that pops up on your desktop when you've installed the extension to do that. The simple thing to remember about it is when you're ready to start recording, you hit the record button. See what little number 1 is pointing there. You hit that record button for it to begin recording your steps, okay? So in my case, what I did was I said, okay, I'm gonna hit that number 1 button. And so when I hit that, it said, okay, it opened up that web page. Remember, I told it where I was gonna start when I created the UI flow. Now when I click record, it pops that open for me, and I start going from there. So as I think about this, I think, okay, as a user, I start on the opportunity, and there's certain fields I get from the opportunity. All I do is I copy and paste them or write them down or whatever I do as a user, but I also have to get some fields from the account. So next I click the account, just like the user would click the account to go to the account form. Let's see, oops, I'm sorry. Okay, so just like the user would click on the account form. So now over on the account form, I apologize, I lost my script here for a second. So when I'm done navigating just like the user would do, I then come over here and click the stop button, stop recording. And you can actually see when I clicked that account button, it captured the keystroke over here, right? So if I go back to where I was before, number 1, I clicked record. Number 2, this popped up. When I clicked this, it started capturing my keystrokes. And if you look at the screen build, those keystrokes have now been captured over here in the Selenium IDE user interface. Okay, well, what do I do with that? Well, now I can do some of my pause to update things, right? So over here in Selenium, what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on one of the commands. So over here is where I said click. And it said, okay, that's click, and it said, here's what you did when you clicked. You clicked on this part of the interface. Great, well, I want to insert a new command now. So it inserts it above that. And what I want to do is I want to store a variable in here. So what does that mean? That means I want to actually grab a variable off the screen and store it in the UI flow. So in this case, step number 3, what I've done is I said, well, what command do I use to grab a value? Store value. I am manually typing that in. Intimidating step, because if you look at that drop down next to command, there's a really long list of commands you can use here. But as a starter, you're probably only going to be using 2 or 3 of them. And Selenium IDE has a lot of documentation and help available online already. So you can go search for those. But mostly you're just going to say, hey, mostly I'm just going to be grabbing values or entering values here. So in this case, I'm going to say, I'm going to store a value. and it says, well, where do you want to go to get that value? And what it's asking over here is, where on the screen do I want to go to get that value? So if I click that little lookup icon there, it's going to bring me back over to the web page. And as I move around this web page, it's going to highlight different things it sees. So when I move over this and hover, it highlighted it in blue. That wasn't me. This was just a screen grab of what it did. So I hovered over topic and clicked it. And when I clicked that, that was my step 5, it put that value in here as target. It said, okay, I've seen what you clicked on. This is where I'm going to go to grab information for you. And value is what I'm going to name it. So op topic. Okay, when you grab that selenium and store it, name that variable, store that value in something called op topic. I want to use it later, okay? Now, one note to you as you do all this. If you're going to be using inputs in Selenium, meaning maybe you got some data from somewhere else and you want to put it into a web application, then in your target field, you're going to express those variables as $, squiggly, your variable name, squiggly, right? So that's a value you got from somewhere else and you're bringing into Selenium to maybe type into a web app. If you're going to capture a value from another application, that's going to be, sorry, it got cut off here, value, the value field equals variable name without the $ or squiggly marks, okay? Took me a little while to get my head around those two different things because they seem a little bit different, but this means I'm grabbing something from the site. This means I'm putting something into the site, okay? And with an output, you're probably going to use store value to grab that output. Okay, just a simple thing to come back and reference later. As you experiment with it, if you're scratching your head a little bit now, you might you're wondering, will I remember to do all that or not? Come back, look at this. The UG folks are recording it. Grab that off the page. And again, there's a great reference there. And if you're not into the technical details, don't worry about it. Sorry, go ahead.
No, just one question, if you don't mind me interrupting.
Sure.
A little bit back here. Which option do you use for a local server AS400 based on ERP system, desktop or web?
Okay, wow. So desktop or web, so you're using AS400 ERP. So it actually depends on how the user interface is rendering. There are AS400 applications that have been transformed into web user interfaces. There are some that run on the desktop. So if it is rendering in a desktop application, it might even be a character-based desktop application, then you would use desktop. If it's running as a web application, you would use web. So basically, if you're accessing it via a browser, use web. If you're accessing it via anything else, use desktop. I hope that answered the question.
Okay, fabulous, fabulous. Thanks, Steph.
Sure thing. So again, I'm kind of on the refining stage here, and you can see I went through and built the whole thing out, right? I navigated to each of the pages. I stored the values from each of the pages, and then I kind of entered my criteria down here. When I'm all done, you can hit the play button in Selenium. So what this will do is actually, while your browser is open, sitting right there in front of you, you can hit play and it goes through every command and you can kind of see it doing, it's literally entering keys, looking at screens, whatever you told it to do. And you can watch it do each one of those things. And at the end, it'll give you a green light, hey, I completed successfully, or a yellow or red light saying, hey, I might have seen some issues. So it kind of builds in a little bit of testing live while you're doing it. When you're done with all that, you just hit save. And when you hit save, it closes out this interface and it drops you back on the Flow UI interface where you can proceed with doing other stuff. So you're done with it at that point, okay? So there's one actual script to take home with you. Okay, now what did I do next? The next thing I said was, hey, my accounting application is running on the desktop. It might be an AS400 application, as someone just asked about, running on the desktop. So now I need to open another UI flow to put stuff into my desktop application. Now, this isn't the case in all cases, right? You might have desktop to desktop. You might have web to web. You might have web to desktop and then back to web for some reason. You can handle any number of those permutations. Right now, we're saying we started in the web, and now we need to move some stuff to a desktop application. So simpler interface at this point, you're going to click you're going to enter your flow name, and then you're going to click next. Now remember, the first time you got to add that item to your browser for this to work. Now the next thing you're presented with a desktop app is it says, hey, what are the inputs you want to have into this particular application? So this is where it's a different mindset. If you're doing a web application, if you remember, I showed you how you kind of decide the inputs as you go. You use those dollar signs and squiggly marks to define different inputs you might need to get. But if you're doing a desktop application, you define your inputs up front. So this starts just as a blank page. You can skip it. If you have no inputs and you're just grabbing information out of your desktop app, skip this step. But if you need to have data entered into your desktop application, you'll define that data here. So if you remember seeing all that data that got keyed into Excel, I've defined each one of those values here. I've given it a name. You plug some sample data in just as a starting point. You're going to substitute that sample data. And you also you're required to put the description in, which is a little bit of a pain in some cases because oftentimes the description is exactly the same as the name. But you define all of your input data, all the stuff that you might be keying into that desktop application there. And then when you're done with that and you click next, you're going to drop into something that looks a lot like the standard Power Automate interface, very different from the Selenium interface you use for the web. So now it says, okay, when you're ready, launch the recorder. Okay, so you're going to click launch the recorder because you're going to start recording your keystrokes. Two things happen when you do that. On the left side there, you see you get this pop-up and it just kind of gives you some directions saying, hey, here's what to do next. And this little guy right here actually drops down from the top middle of your screen. And it's sitting there waiting for you to begin recording. So essentially, even though you said start recording, it's not going to start yet. It's just going to start the interface saying, I'm ready. All you need to do to start recording is click this record button, and I'm going to begin recording your keystrokes and mouse clicks and everything else. Okay, so you're going to click that record button. Now, once you're recording, in this case, I went in and I opened Excel and I typed in a file name and all of those kinds of things, and now I'm actively recording. So when I'm actively recording, and you can see I have this Excel open, this is my accounting application, right? So if you think about this as your AS400 application, and I have some fields on it that I want to fill in, now this is currently running, doesn't say record anymore, it says pause. While it's still running, I go click in the field I want to add something to, I click the use input drop down, I select what input I want to put where. After I click the input I want, I click on that field name. In fact, I don't need to click on it beforehand. I click on it after, and it keys the information from that input field directly into wherever I've just clicked the mouse, right? So that could be a notepad application. It could be AS400, whatever it is. But it says, okay, whatever you've given me as input, I'm going to type it there. And literally, I'm going to type it there. You could embed control keystrokes in there. You could do anything you want. It's not pasting it. It's literally typing each one of those keys instead of the user doing that for you. So you can see I just basically went around to each field on this. For each field, I kind of said use input. Which input do I want? What field do I want it to go to? When I click that field, I see it type that in there for me. Then I go to the next, then I go to the next. If I want to get output from something, such as maybe I'm going to my AS400 application, I want to get stuff out of that application, I can click Get Output, and just like Selenium, but a different user interface now, I can go click on the screen where I want to get the output, and it's going to go, great, I'm going to save that as an output for you that you can reference later if you want to. Okay, when you're done, you just click the done button over on the little recorder that's popped down in the middle of the screen. And when you're done, you might get something big and scary and ugly like this. I've zoomed way out on it so it looks a lot more intimidating. If you've ever done a Power Automate, this looks kind of similar to a Power Automate, but every keystroke, or at least every input that you put in, is now recorded. So let me bring up a couple of those just so you can kind of see an example. If I were to open any one of those little blue boxes, it's going to give me a screenshot. So it's going to say, hey, here's what the screen looked like when you did this, and here's what happened. So you can see in these couple of steps, it said, hey, you opened browse for files in Outlook on this step. And then in the next step, it said, oh, you keyed a value in here for the file name. So I can go look at each one of those steps. And remember, refining, I then need to go back and say, well, if it's a different file name for different circumstances, I need to plug a variable in to make that file name happen. So this is where I go and do my refining to make that work the way I need it to work. Okay, and when I'm all done, it says Hey, if you've defined any outputs, here they are. Now in mine, I didn't define any outputs. My outputs were defined in the web flow UI because I was getting outputs from that, and then I input things into the desktop. But remember that little drop down click, I could have said define an output. If I defined any of those would now be here, and I could take a look at those to see if those matched what I needed them to be as well. And then it takes me to a screen that says test. Remember at the end of the Selenium, the web application, I kind of said hit the play button and we'll play through everything. I can do the same thing here. So it's basically reminding me again, hey, here's all your input values. If you want to play with those and do something different, you can. If you want to leave them the way you defined them up front, you can do that too. But if you want to click test now, you can just click that and it will play back my macro, play back my robotic process automation, and I can physically sit there and watch it play through all those steps to make sure it's doing what I expect it to do. And by the way, notice one thing here. All of these fields were outputs that I captured from the web UI, except for this one down here. This is a file name that I defined myself, okay? So that's what I keyed in to Excel to open that file. Now in my case, it's always the same, so it can be static, but you can even have it be different if you need it to be. Okay, let's talk gotchas about the recording process for a second here. So there are a lot of little gotchas with this. I'm sure that they will get more and more smoothed out over time. Once you get used to it, it'll be a little more comfortable. First overall gotcha, 2 different applications, okay? Takes a little while to get your head around that. I watched a bunch of videos that maybe I missed it, but they didn't seem to call that out. Know that as you get into it. If you're working with desktop application, it's one app. If you're working with a web application, it's another app that you're activating. And if you're working with both, you're going to use both apps at different times. How you bring them together, I'll talk about that in a minute. When you define a UI flow, you cannot copy it or save it as. So I'm hoping they will change that in the future. But when I went through doing some of this for you guys, there were times when I thought, I want to test something out here, but I don't want to mess up all this work that I've just done. But I couldn't just save it as and do it again. So I wound up kind of deleting a step and changing some things, messing it up, having to start all over again and re-record it because I couldn't figure out how to get it back to the state that it was before. Do expect a lot of trial and error with either one of these, particularly in the earlier days of using it. Like anything else, if someone's going to be a regular user, they're going to be much stronger than somebody who tries to do this the first time. There is a premium connector required to play these back in Power Automate, which is essentially required. I'm not going to talk about licensing today. Be aware of licensing, know what the licensing issues are when you get into using these. And the biggest disappointment to me is, like much of the rest of Power Automate, this really isn't for non-technical users. It doesn't have to be for developers per se, but I know going back to, when I still do create Excel macros from time to time, and when I did stuff in the distant past, it was a little more approachable, a little less technical than this feels like it needs to be. And maybe as this matures, it'll get a little easier for non-technical people to use it. Again, I'm not saying you have to be a hardcore developer, super deep technical person. What I am saying is, if you're not comfortable ever having done anything like a workflow and a pretty sophisticated workflow at that, you're probably going to struggle to get comfortable with this too. Web recording. So when recording using the Selenium IDE, the recorder may not always capture the right clicker value. When you click on a field thinking you're getting the value that's in that field, there's a lot going on behind the scenes with websites, and so sometimes it's missing what you think it's getting. So you're going to have to do a lot of testing and refining to make sure you're getting what you're using. It does require that Selenium IDE. Some people may argue that that is not a programming language, but I would say, from the stuff you saw up there, although it may help you to build some of that stuff, it's pretty sophisticated stuff. And Selenium IDE is a third-party app. So it's a very different user experience creating it. Now, your end users who run these things, they're not going to see that. But you, the person who's developing these things, you're going to have to get used to seeing that, okay? And for for desktop recording, recording doesn't always match the user experience. A couple of examples. So when I opened that Excel file, I couldn't just click on the first file in the recently opened list because it may not always be there. So I have to go browse to find the file. And when I browse to find the file, I actually can't do that. I've got to be prepared and have that entire file name to type in, because again, it's not going to know where to browse. What if the file name changes in their different scenarios. So that's one difference. For some reason in particular, keying stuff into Excel was very temperamental. I think you'll run into that with other things too. However, through trial and error, I was able to work all of it out. So know that it might take a little bit of time. Again, editing a UI flow can be difficult. You might have to start over. You can't save it as and then modify from there. You need to kind of work on it in place. And also one other little gotcha I noticed is remember how that record button shows up at the top of the screen, as do the inputs and outputs buttons. If those are over the top of something you want to be doing on the screen, it doesn't end well. So make sure your application is not running underneath that little drop down thing that it creates up there. Try to move your window down below that if at all possible. Okay, so we talked about record. Let's talk a little bit about refining and running. It's a shorter conversation, which is good. We're getting a little short on time. So, and we already talked a little bit about refining, but let's talk about it a little bit more in refining the elements and actually running them together. So one of the things you might have noticed was we built these UI flows. And if you've ever built one, you might look at it and then go, well, now what do? I've got these two separate UI flows that don't talk to each other. If I go look at UI flow, there's no obvious way to link those together. There's not even an obvious way to trigger those to start. What do? Well, the way that those work is you go into Power Automate to a regular Power Automate flow, whatever those are called, they're on the far left side when you go to create a new flow, and you create a triggering event. And that triggering event can be something the user does manually, it can be a change in a database, any kind of Power Automate trigger you can use. And then you call your UI flow from there. So in other words, remember on the little demo I ran through, in CRM, I went and said, go pull down my menu of flows. Now choose the flow that said copy op to ERP or whatever I called it. That was a Power Automate trigger. So it triggered when the user did something and the user action was something on the opportunity on CRM. So that triggered the web flow at that point. Now I can do any number of Power Automate steps within there that I want to as well. So I don't have to do all of this in RPA. I can do some stuff using UI flows, robotic process automation. I can do some things with Power Automate. You mix and match the two together. And so I didn't really have that intermediate Power Automate step here. I had a UI flow that said, call the web flow UI, do its thing, then call the desktop flow UI, let it do its thing, and by the way, pass some variables between the two of those. Let's take look at a couple of other high-level things, and then we'll look specifically at how I did that. So remember, we talked about BPA and RPA and the difference between those two things. The really cool thing about Power Automate RPAs is you can do BPA and RPA in one place. Most RPA tools that are out there right now, and there are simple ones that you can just run on a desktop and very sophisticated ones, but they tend to focus almost exclusively on RPA, on simulating user interaction with the interface. But with Power Automate, you can do the things in BPA that are better to do in BPA, in regular Power Automate, and you can use RPA for those things that you just can't solve using BPA. Okay, sorry for all the acronyms. Hopefully I've educated you guys enough that you know what I'm talking about. So I can put those things together in a hybrid. We're gonna take a look at that as a part of this as well before we adjourn for the day. So refine and run, what do we do next? So remember I said the first thing to do is go create a regular Power Automate. So I created my Power Automate the way I'd create any Power Automate that CRM would start. So in this case, I said when a record is selected, and then I said, well, what kind of record? Well, it's an opportunity record. Okay, great. Then I add a section to that record. That section is a UI flow. By the way, if you look closely at this, you can say, okay, I'm going to add a UI flow. I can run a UI flow for web, or I can run a UI flow for desktop. Well, my first one's going to be for web. Little reminder there, premium license required in order to do that. So I'm going to choose run from the web first, because that's where I'm collecting my information. Now, the next thing you need to know is when you are going to now run a UI flow, you need to install yet another thing on your computer. It's called an on-premises data gateway. First time you do this, you're going to be prompted through this process. This is a weird process. It takes a little getting used to. Essentially, it's there to basically say, hey, stuff going on in Microsoft's cloud, Power UI, and Office 365, it can interact it can interact with your computer and data that's sitting on your computer. You can install these things literally on servers and stuff like that too. In this case, you're installing it to do some stuff on a user desktop. And ideally what you would do is you actually install this physically on the desktop of the user that's going to run it. But while you're developing it, you'd put it on your own. So you've got to put that on-premises data gateway in place to actually let this thing run on the desktop in production. So you go through that one time only. If you do it wrong, you got to kind of uninstall and reinstall it. So it's a little bit of a headache until you get used to it, but expect to spend a few hours getting used to it. Then you'll be able to support your team doing that for all of them as well. And you can see in its simplest state, my UI flow has only 3 steps in it, right? It says, okay, when that opportunity record is selected, I'm going to have this be visible for the user to run it there. When they run it, I'm going to run my UI flow for the web. And then after that's done, I'm going to run my UI flow for the desktop. Sounds simple enough. A little more to it than that, but not much. So we already talked about that first step. When I run my UI flow for the web, it basically says, okay, which one do you want to run? It actually says, what browser do you want to use to run this with? So you need to choose one of the browsers available on your desktop. You can run it attended or unattended. Now, unattended does not mean it will run in the background while the user is working. It still needs access to that computer to be able to run. So look that up. There's some details you need to know. Attended means it's going to run while the user is sitting there physically watching it, or they're on their computer logged in. And then it says, it looks at it intelligently and says, what are the inputs that I'm being asked for right now? So remember my UI flow for the web, one input that I did define for that was I need a URL, right? The URL is the URL of that opportunity that I want to grab information from. So in this case, what I did was I grabbed the URL from CRM of opportunities in general. I sliced off the ID of that particular opportunity, and I grabbed the opportunity ID that was defined up here when a record is selected. So it basically says, hey, whatever opportunity the user is on when they run this, that's the opportunity that I want you to open when you run this flow. Now, my UI flow for the desktop, it says, okay, I've got all these input variables for that. Remember that long list of variables that I defined? How am I going to plug those in? Well, remember, those are all output variables from here. So as I go use the smart option to fill these things in, I can just go pick the values that were taken out of this and drop them directly in here, and I'm ready to go. So that's it. I've defined my entire UI flow at that point. If I run that, it would run and look just like what I showed you earlier. I'm going to give you a few more insights into it before we finish. And remember, I'm also going to tell you, well, what did I do wrong? There's actually something I did wrong in that whole thing that is not a best practice. You may already be guessing what it is, but if you haven't, it's a really important and not so subtle thing to know about. So some of the gotchas. Playback in desktop apps, slow. You can speed up the pause between steps if you want to, but it sometimes just seems painstakingly slow. That video that I showed you, that was literally it running in real time. So you can actually watch it doing what it does. It's probably faster than a user still, but sometimes you think this thing could run so much more faster, but it kind of waits after it finishes entering one thing and goes on to the next and that kind of thing. It does run directly on the user desktop. You can't be doing anything else while you're running that. In fact, when it starts, it'll even put something up there basically saying, hey, I'm going to do something now. Don't touch anything until I'm all done. It will open up separate sessions that do require a login. Remember in my demo how I started it and I said, oh, I got to log into my browser again. It's not going to run it right in the browser session that the user was using that they triggered it in. It's going to create its own browser session, and it's not going to remember your login credentials, so you're going to need to type those in. That's not necessarily a bad thing. That protects you, but it is a little bit of a time-consuming thing. You can put your credentials into the flow if you want to, but those are stored as plain text. Really bad idea to do that. That on-premise gateway is a little bit complex. And one small thing that may not affect many of you guys, but it only runs on true 64-bit PCs. So I actually typically use a Surface Pro X, which is 64-bit, but it's a new type of ARM processor that Microsoft put in there, and it runs in 32-bit simulated mode for some reason. So just know, if you're running into headaches, you might want to check your PC to make sure you've got running the right version of Windows at 64-bit, and it's a 64-bit processor in there. So some little gotchas in there. Once you get through those, not too bad. So I talked about this a little earlier. When should you RPA? Really when you've exhausted your other options, right? It's not the first thing you go to. It's more like the last thing you go to. when you can't do stuff with API automation, or that kind of automation is just too expensive or time consuming. And only do it for the parts of your process where it's necessary. So you may be able to do parts with regular Power Automate, BPA, but parts might require this. So minimize where you use it to maximize the efficiency with how things are doing. And what are some good use cases for this? Anything you're consistently or routinely doing over time, right? Where you're following a very consistent set of steps. And if there's inconsistencies, there can be rules that define the differences between them, right? Inconsistency meaning something like, well, I always retype this information back into this other application. The information I type is different, but what I type is pretty consistent. Okay, well, the rule is go to this other application to get it. If you got lots of copying, pasting, rekeying, it's great for cleaning and refining data. For doing quick web lookups, you can even bop over to LinkedIn real quick, do a search by lead name, and have that LinkedIn information show up for you automatically if you wanted to. And testing, by the way, is another great thing to use this for. So if you say, well, we've defined some new stuff in CRM, and it's 30 new fields on the opportunity entity, and I want to kind of hit those hard and make sure that I'm able to consistently absorb keystrokes the way I expect them to, well, you can set up an RPA procedure to actually simulate the user keying things in and make sure it can get all the way through that use case before it closes out. Okay, so now what you might have been waiting for. So what did I do wrong? Now you may remember the first thing I did was to create a Flow UI for the web. And I had all this code here, and we learned a lot about that, and that was cool. And I did it because this was a demo presentation, and I wanted you guys to be able to see how that worked. However, I should not have done that at all, because I don't need to do that with robotic process automation. Remember I said it's the last thing you should use and only when absolutely necessary. Well, here's what my flow looked like. Remember this before. If I did it right, here's what it would look like. Now, that might look like it's one more step, but remember, behind each of those blue boxes are lots of steps, all those steps on that previous slide I showed you. But also behind each of those blue boxes are manual interaction with the desktop interface, whereas these purple boxes are all regular business process flow. And so what I did was I said, okay, the user has selected an opportunity. Using the API, go get the account that opportunity belongs to, and go get the contact that opportunity belongs to. And now that I've done those two things, all the information in all of those entities is available for me to type all of this in. No the user having to log into a separate instance of the browser, no waiting for it to capture information from the browser. All that stuff is done in a heartbeat as it just goes to CRM and grabs all that information, and it just opens up the accounting application and puts all that information in there. This is the right way to do this kind of process. Okay, so we're probably right up against our time here. Quick closing things to remember: record, refine, and run. If I drill a little more deeply into that, because this is not an end user activity necessarily, remember to follow the basic process of listen to your users, find the repetitive tasks, be sure you record their steps and really understand them so you can connect those with good automated processes using the right combination of BPA, RPA, API, GUI, and lots of other TLAs, and then run it and assume it's not going to be perfect. Things are going to change. Someone's going to change that web user interface. Someone's going to add a new field to that CRM form or take a field away that messes it up, and you might have to come back and clean it up over time. So have good expectations as you go in. Lori talked about a lot of these, tons of sessions coming up. One I'd urge you guys to check out tomorrow is Rapidly Going Remote. Excellent one. It's 2 hours long with about 5 or 6 different speakers talking about how their organizations are using Office and other tools to go remote. And if you want to dig into any more of this, you like the idea of luck, there's a book. You can get it on Amazon. Microsoft Teams, we've put a couple of great guidebooks out there for those of you who might be trying to adopt that rapidly right now. And again, we are in the business of doing this. So if you are looking for help with Power Automate, Dynamics, Teams, Office, we would love to be able to help you out. There's my email address. Reach out if you want any of those resources or just to engage with me. Thank you all so much for coming today. I hope this was really helpful.
All right. Thanks so much, Jeff. And yes, please do join us tomorrow. With Dynamic Communities, we have a great series together, the Community Response Series, we're calling it. And Jeff mentioned his session tomorrow. So yes, go get registered. Join us tomorrow. Jeff's a great presenter, so you're in for more of a treat tomorrow if you join us. So as we close down, definitely want to thank you for being here. If you have questions, please reach out directly to Jeff. Otherwise, you can go through us as well. Jeff, thanks for being here as always. Much appreciated.
Thank you all. Have a great day.
All right. Take care, all. You will receive a quick pop-up survey. If you can take a couple moments to give us some feedback, that would be great. And again, thanks for being here all. Take care of it, and we'll see you real soon.